Hello and welcome back. I didn't actually think through the intro.
You could just
Okay,
have said, "Welcome back to Kip Crashes."
I could have, but hello and welcome back to Kip Crashes, where today we're going to be talking about our opinions on advice for young artists because we feel like no one knows how to give advice to young artists. I'm joined with, of course, Kip.
Hi, I'm here to offer my unnecessary 2 cents.
Thank you, Kip. For clarification, I'm an aspiring visual artist and they are an aspiring literate artist.
More than you.
Yeah, I can't read. But I draw, they write, and we were talking about this a while ago and found out that we have two very different opinions on young artists and many of the principles that they should be following when they're starting out. But we also had some overlap in our opinions. So we thought we would talk about both of them, look at our opinions, give some advice, and talk it through. Having said that, no advice is absolute.
Also, Pocket, what are you drawing in the background there?
Right, as we're talking, we're going to have video of me doing some Artfight attacks in the background. Any characters that I'm drawing, the link both to the character and to the person who drew it will be in the description, along with my own Artfight if you want to go attack me or see the other attacks I've done. Awesome. In that case, we're going to start off with visual art and my opinions on it, while Kip sits in the background patiently listening. All right, so my first piece of advice is a simple one, but one that I don't think is given to young artists enough. It's never spend more time in your first 2 or so years of art practicing technique over drawing for fun and experimenting. The thing is that when you're a young artist, you constantly hear things like fundamentals and art basics and basic form and value and shape and all of these words that don't really mean anything to you. And of course, as a young artist, part of your job is to learn what they mean and figure out how to apply them to your art. But at the same time, don't get too caught up in them. Spend plenty of time just drawing what you like, drawing fan art or your new OC that you came up with rainbow hair. Draw whatever makes you happy and don't lose your passion for art. If you're spending too much time practicing, you'll forget why you're drawing and what's fun about it. So make sure never to lose sight of that.
I'm going to go ahead and add on that that applies really well with writing. It's because certainly, especially once you hit high school and you're constantly writing all the time for essays and science reports, and it can really take the fun out of writing because you end up constantly judging your art, and that can bleed over. And some of the techniques that are really good for essay writing don't work at all for actual, like, professional writing, actual creative writing, I should say. So it's not. So when you're doing that, you always need to set something aside so that you can write. And I can hear you all saying, "But I'm writing so many essays. I'm writing all the time. I don't have time to write more in my free time." You
Makes
have
sense.
free time, right? Seriously, I know that it's a lot of extra work, but that's the arts for you. You've got to have that sort of commitment to it because otherwise you will lose track of the artistic side of it.
All right, on to the second point. Have a sketchbook and don't be afraid to play in it. A lot of times when you're going through YouTube and you're looking for sketchbook tours to see how the professionals draw their sketchbooks, you see page after page of these glossy, brilliant, beautiful, thought through designs and drawings and like spreads that are thought through so nicely. And the truth is that's not what a sketchbook should look like. That's not what a sketchbook is for. On the screen, you'll see some of the pictures of what I think are some of my favorite sketchbook pages. And you'll notice that they're not pretty or carefully designed. Some of them I think have aesthetic value, but the reason that I like them so much is because I experimented and I played around and I learned new things. A sketchbook is for a lot of different things, whether it's drawing things you like so that you can continue in your artistic journey and find what makes you happy in art. In this, I should add that fan art is a great thing for young artists, and we'll talk about it more in a separate video because it's a video unto itself. But never be afraid to draw fan art, especially in your sketchbook. And more so, do things like trying materials and color palettes, sketching for fun, drawing your alarm clock because it looks weird at the angle you're sitting at, or whatever. And try drawing things you've never drawn before. Something not talked about enough is the principle of a visual library, where there are things that you get more and more comfortable with drawing, therefore need less reliance on reference.
Mhm.
As important as references are for drawing, it's important to expand the library of things that you're comfortable drawing with so that you're not always drawing wolves and then the first time that you draw something that isn't a wolf, it still really, really looks like a wolf.
Wolf likes giraffes are a thing.
Yeah, they're a thing that exists in my old sketchbooks, and I'm not proud of them. So just make sure that you're constantly expanding your repertoire of things you're drawing. Have fun with them. They don't have to be real animals. Just draw new things, really, is kind of the premise of that point.
Pocket, how those humans coming?
Awesome. Thanks. I still don't know how to draw them. But practice. Practice makes better. Practice makes better.
Actually, that's a really good point on craft. There's no such thing as perfect art.
My third point. So, one that I unfortunately have to agree with the masses on is something that is told to young artists but never explained properly or why it matters so much, or at least it never was to me, is drawing from life and how miserably and unfortunately it is also insanely important. Drawing from life is something that you're told all the time as a young artist, but what does it actually mean? It means sitting down in front of your computer with a sketchbook and drawing your computer, trying to stand up and then drawing it from top down, and then laying down on the floor and drawing it the way you see it. Trying to capture exactly how you're seeing whatever life is in front of you. It could be your books or that statue your grandmother got for you.
So you're saying that I don't have to stand up in one of those stupid white toga robes in my art classroom and I have to stand on top of something because no one can see me because I am short and stand there for 15 minutes while kids sketch me.
I'm I'm not saying that. No, I've had to do that before. It's the
Make it
worst.
stop! I've done that.
So have I. It's awful. It's so good for your art development, but it's so bad for your sanity. Guys,
Oh god.
I'm going to art school soon and I'm going to have to probably draw nude models at some point in that, and I'm already
Oh my
terrified.
god, you're gonna die.
Having said that, it's super important for young artists to draw from life. Don't draw nude people, though. That's weird.
Thank you.
um, but the thing that's never really properly explained to young artists is, why does it matter so much? Why does it matter so much that I draw the apple that my mother gave me to eat for lunch as opposed to an apple on Pinterest? And the truth is that most people have something called depth perception, where your brain automatically assumes the depth of whatever you're looking at. Therefore, when you're drawing it, you start to understand how that 3D form starts to translate into the two-dimensional world on your paper. And you learn how to convert 3D into 2D in a way you can't do when you're looking at your computer, because whatever you're looking at is already being given to you in 2 dimensions.
Wait, it's a
More,
thing you can't do when looking at your computer?
yeah.
I thought that. Oh, you mean at your computer screen? My brain went back to when you were talking about drawing your computer. Sorry,
Ah,
continue.
no, you're good. Which is something you can't do when looking at your computer screen or Pinterest and Tumblr and the like, because you're already being given it in 2 dimensions, so you don't have to convert it from 3D to 2D, which is something that is insanely important. And also, it teaches you things like color and light, because when you're sitting in the real world, you have an innumerable amount of different light sources. You have whatever light you have on your ceiling, you might have a lamp in your room. Every surface is at least somewhat reflective. So when you're drawing from life, you can start to understand how that all interacts together in a way that is also a lot harder to do on the computer, because a lot of drawings have already simplified that down. It teaches you how to convert the complex 3D world into what you want to draw. And it's incredibly important, but also don't stress over it too much. If it's something that freaks you out, do it once a month or so. Set yourself a small goal so that you're doing it occasionally and slowly developing the skill, but don't worry about it as much.
This is also something that I think is really important for writers, is learning how to take small moments from their everyday life and translate those onto the page. Now, I'm not saying massively project your problems and experiences and every single thing that you're struggling with onto your characters. But I am saying that if there is a difficulty you're running into that you look at and you go, "Oh my god, wait, one of my characters might end up encountering something like this with someone else." Try writing down that experience and then try writing down their reaction to it. Don't put your reaction down unless it's a self insert. Don't do self inserts. Not full on. Everyone can have a piece of you in there, but don't do a full self insert. Doesn't end well. Um, but but actually, a little fun exercise on the note of that I still remember I was given at a little writing convention at one point was when somebody turned to me and said, "Imagine 5 things that someone can have in their pocket. Write those down. Now ask yourself why they have those things in their pocket. And then build on that." And I still remember to a point what those things were. And I still have that character in my head. And that was so many years ago, I don't remember how old I was, but I remember the character. So that's always something that's worthwhile if you're trying to also flesh out your character. Put them in the real world. Take your character grocery shopping with you. What will they buy? What's their thought process as they buy it? Are they desperately trying to figure out how to conserve enough money? Hope's telling.
Exactly. Regardless of who your character is or what universe they exist in, whether you're drawing dragons or writing fantasy magic girls from some random manga, they do still have a basis in the real world. They have to, or else your readers or viewers won't be able to understand what you're communicating. So try taking them from the real world and into the real world to understand how they would exist there. It'll give your drawings or writing a lot more depth and make them make a lot more sense to those that are looking at them.
You always make sure that your characters are people that can be related to.
Exactly. Awesome. And kind of building off of that, of things that aren't the most fun but are incredibly important, are art warm ups and exercises. They're something that really aren't explained thoroughly to anyone because there's such a wide variety of them. But before you get into any major drawing that you find interesting, do some warm up sketches. For example, if you're going to draw a dragon eating off the head of another person, try playing around with what a dragon would look like, doing some small, tiny sketches of just a dragon moving around, and maybe a decapitated person. This way, your hand muscles and your brain muscles are literally warmed up for the exercise. Just like if you were playing volleyball, you wouldn't walk into the gym and immediately start playing your tournament. You would start by stretching and limbering up so that you could play at your best. The same thing is true for art. And as for exercises, I'll have some pictures of some fun exercises on the screen, but there's a million of them out on the internet. Drawing circles, drawing lines, making sure that you're drawing from your shoulder to loosen up your muscles. Doing 5 or so minutes of this every time before you start drawing is super important for you. You don't have to do it every time, but the more times you do it, the more loose your muscles will be and the more used to drawing they'll get.
Which also means you can potentially avoid some injuries, much like with volleyball. Um,
Indeed.
but on that note, this is one of the spots where we wildly differ because while I absolutely agree that warm-up exercises work for a lot of people and that they're very, very important because of the value you get on doing artwork that is incredibly low stakes. Also, I don't find that it works for everyone. I know that it definitely did not work for me. I would just kind of do them and then walk away. They never did a lot for me, even if I did them on a very, very regular basis. The only way that it ended up working for me was if I had some sort of a stake in it. I just found a way to make it more low stakes. It couldn't be a one and done for me. So, and this is once again something we'll actually go into depth on later, I found fanfic to be far more easy for me, where I would do one shots with characters. And that would be a much better way of getting my mind a little bit more limber before I started working on my actual original work. Again, though, fanfic is something that we'll go into later, but just remember when you're doing this that exercises don't have to be these prompts that you find on the internet. There's creative ways to do, well, it's not that those aren't creative. There's other ways to do your stretches. There's other ways to do artistic stretches.
Exactly. With art, I'm slightly more strict on certain things because exercises are super important to me, certain line exercises and circle exercises. But even if the specific ones I'm showing you don't work, just find something that works for you. It doesn't have to be anything grand or something you spend hours on every day. Just make sure you're practicing and if nothing else, paying close attention to it when you're doing your actual artwork.
Yeah, and that's a big one, practicing every day.
Yep, and on that note, let's go on to my next point, which is do your best to draw something for fun every day. This doesn't have to be some elaborate illustration you spend 7 of your hours. Nope. This doesn't have to be some elaborate illustration that you spend 7 hours a day on. Just do something fun. Pull out your sketchbook and draw a couple circles on it. The thing is that a lot of artists find it hard to do daily work. So here's a quick tip. Pull out your sketchbook, clean up your table, and do whatever you need to do to make sure that you can draw, and then set a timer for 5 minutes. Tell yourself you're going to draw for 5 minutes every day. Set the timer, start the timer, and just draw. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be circles and squares and triangles, or Pokemon or dragons, or whatever you want it to be. When the timer is up, you can just as well leave the drawing. But according to my experience and others, a lot of times once you're there, once you're drawing, you're into the rhythm and you're probably going to draw for a lot longer. But if nothing else, draw for 5 minutes and see what happens.
This is another one of the spots where we completely disagree, even though obviously I still think that their point is completely valid and will work for a ton of people. We're just trying to display the fact that there's a myriad of experiences within the artistic world and a myriad of ways to handle and to put these practices that people are constantly suggesting, well, into practice, to put the advice that everyone is suggesting into practice. Because the advice isn't always necessarily bad, it's just vague. For instance, the idea of writing every single day is completely necessary in my mind. And I don't mean, yes, I have an essay today, as I already ranted about. That's not the same. Write something creative. For me, what I actually tend to do is stare at the page and think. And I will often be doing something different with my hands at the same time. And it helps to keep everything sort of flowing. And I'll be imagining things for the scene. And I'll be running through what could be said and what could be happening. And I'll have this whole little scene playing out in my head until I finally get it to actually tell me what the first line is supposed to be. Then, once I get the first line, it's usually smoother sailing from there. But sometimes I end up having to repeat the process a lot.
And this is actually where I have to interrupt with a distinctly different perspective simply from visual art, where I firmly believe that people can't visualize in their mind half as well as they think they can. They oftentimes will stare at a piece of paper in their mind doing exactly what they just said, milling over the composition and where the dragon will go, but when they end up drawing it, it still looks flat and two dimensional. Instead, with this one, I do come back to my advice of playing on paper. Pull out your sketchbook and just start sketching the exact same things you're doing in your mind, but play on paper with some thumbnails as to what you're going to eventually draw. Again, this might not work for everyone, and their advice might work better for you, but I passionately believe that with visual art specifically, it's better to play on paper.
Yep, which makes a lot of sense. The other thing is, since I tend to be very visual in my thinking, despite the fact that I am very much a literary artist, for me, visualizing is particularly helpful. For a lot of artists, I can imagine that would be distinctly not helpful because they're trying to get words on the page, so they want to just start writing. But the thing is, if you don't have any sort of plan on what's going to have come afterwards, or any sort of idea of the scene that follows, it's hard to get that groundwork set up at the beginning if you don't already have something playing in your head. But again, this is completely subjective advice.
Awesome. My next point is one that I know a lot of young artists are going to hate to hear, but I stand by it. And that is bluntly, how to draw books are useless. Okay, not entirely. The three-step to draw books are awful. The ones where they're like, draw a circle here and a circle here, then draw a triangle here and a triangle here, and then you have a dog. Those just don't work in the long term. They might teach you how to draw a dog in three-quarter view with floppy ears and a snoopy tail, but at the end of the day, you haven't learned how to draw anything.
Not just that, but if you actually get something, but if you actually manage to get that shape out of them, I know, color me impressed because I got so many of those books trying to learn how to draw. All I got was confusion in return.
Which is fair, they're not particularly useful. However, that doesn't mean you should never look at an art book again, because there are ways to find beneficial information within these books. There are both three-step to draw books with genuinely important information about style and tips. For example, Christopher Hart's Humongous Book of Cartooning is one where, while the actual three-step to draw books are not particularly useful, he has points within it that explain how his style works, which I think really embellishes the book. More importantly, though, there are books like The Art of Books, Art of Loish, or Art of Into the Spider-Verse, which are incredibly important. If you can flip through them and see what you like and don't like and start doing studies off of them, you'll learn a lot. And if you're wondering how to do these studies, that's definitely going to be a separate video. There's too much there to cover in here, but just know that it's an important thing to do. You can also find craft books that tell you how to do the craft. For example, Drawing Before Breakfast or the Animator or the Animator's Survival Guide, and wonderful
Ants,
webs.
ants, ants. The Antimator sounds like one of those horrible, like, freaking names that they would do for some villain in The Incredibles. I am the Antimator!
I am the Animator. Yes. Yeah,
So
I'm
you're
the
dead
Animator.
inside.
I am dead inside. Quite. Anyway, but the Animator's Survival Guide or wonderful websites like Control Paint, which I will have a link for in the description, are amazing ways to learn how to draw without getting stuck in the three steps to draw phase. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's on Control Paint that he gives you a real three steps to draw.
And while some of those skills will translate, a lot of them won't, or certainly will not suffice. So that'll be something that we'll discuss at a later date. But also, craft books for writing. Oh boy. So Craft books with writing are very useful. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. If you can find the right ones, they are incredibly useful. Highly recommend, especially if you're going to do a screenwriter thing. But honestly, even if you're just doing novels, novels are a bitch. But honestly, even if you're doing novels, I highly recommend Save the Cat. It's something that is very useful on learning how to handle characters, and you'll learn a lot even within the first few pages, especially if you're trying to work on characters that you intend to redeem in the future, but who start off with a less than good streak. Craft books, however, do have the unfortunate side effect of giving your editor's voice a little bit too much power. So, just for those that aren't entirely sure what I'm talking about here, I think most writers are able to develop very quickly a writer's voice in their head, which will give them, the stories that they're working on, and allows their characters to come forth and, guide the story. The editor's voice is what happens when you're trying to actually refine the story. It's, well, the editing process. Kind of self explanatory. But here's the biggest problem. While those two voices are incredibly helpful when they are separated, when they're not separated, they tend to get in the way. If your editor's voice is playing while you're writing, which can frequently happen when you've read too many craft books and haven't spent enough time writing, or when you're trying too hard to focus on integrating the newest tips into the process, then you're going to run into a lot of problems because it won't flow and you're going to end up getting stuck back on your work and not actually get so much as a page down. It's going to mess with your flow. So while craft books are very important, make sure that you've got a strong artistic flow going first, or that you set aside specific time to work on integrating those elements into, again, low stakes things. It would be perfect to work on the craft elements while doing a warm up, but until you have them fully integrated very naturally into your writing flow, you don't want to be transposing those directly into your other works.
Which is definitely something I agree with art. Like I said, I'll go a little more into depth on how I study other artists and how I implement that into my artwork in a separate video, but I do want to say here that that is an amazing piece of advice. If you find something you want to try incorporating into your artwork, try incorporating it into warm-ups and doodles and sketchbook exercises before you try and jump in to the real mess of things and try and incorporate it into your proper art. And my final point, which we'll talk about a little more once I let them talk about literary and we get into overlap, is that the devil's in the details. A lot of times, younger artists make a drawing very quickly that they consider a final piece. I'm talking here about final pieces, not sketchbook exercises or anything like that. But they don't incorporate the polish, the final few steps, which really, if you're trying to find a way to get your art to the next level and you're looking at it and you're going, but the color's fine, the line work's fine, everything's kind of evened out, try and look at how you can polish your artwork, how you can add some texture or some lighting to really take it to that next little step and give it a nice glossy sheen. Again, we'll talk a lot more about the devils in the details once we get past literary. Having said that, Kip, why don't you take the reins?
Okay, so again, I'll also go a little bit more into in the details once we actually head into overlap, but I'm going to wait a little bit because it's such a substantial point that it's more worth having a long discussion on. Does that work? One of the things that I was told all the time to distinctly not do, that I am going to say is the best thing that I ever did, is to learn on stories. Now, I definitely was the type that was just had tons of stories in my head when I was little, and I wrote all of them, or at least started writing all of them. And some of them, basically, my marker was once I hit 50 pages, I usually was sticking with this piece. And yes, I mean that I have stopped things at 25 pages, do not ask. But one of the things that I noticed very substantially started when I worked on what I still consider to be my proper first book, which was that throughout the process, I got substantially better. And that meant that by the end of the story, the start was at a far lower quality than the end, which it's not ideal when you're writing a story for there to be a noticeable change in skill level. At the very least, at least that noticeable of a change in skill level. So I was frequently told to stop doing that. I was told a lot, your writing is really coming into it right now, which you will hear all the time. Your writing is always into it. Ignore that. And your drawing is as well, obviously. But I was told a lot to stop working on my stories, set the ideas to the side, and spend the time refining my craft. That way, I could write the stories and not have to worry about potentially scrapping them because the quality level was too low. To that, I say no. And I said no. And the result was I rewrote my stories a lot. I know that currently I'm still rewriting that very first story that I was telling you about. It's something that worked exceptionally well for me, and I understand it doesn't work well for everybody. There's a reason that a lot of people told me to knock it off. But I also know that if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have been able to get nearly as good as I am currently. What I did through that process was learn how these characters needed to evolve, and I learned to tinker, let's say, my writing process for each story. I learned to figure out whether a story needed actual planning or whether I needed to distinctly not have any sort of planning. This gave me a very flexible writing process. Not to mention, it gave me a very specific voice that comes from working on stories and well, very little else because your characters really do shape your voice. And on that note, something I definitely want to talk about. Now, one of the things I got told a lot on that note is that, and that I'm going to disagree with very strongly, is that your first stories will never see the light of day. This is incorrect. Now, it's correct to a point. Let's be honest. I look at my sixth grade writing and I just kind of hide in a corner and say, please don't publish this. Anyone, please, no. Because your writing evolves and it gets a lot better. And that means your story ideas will evolve as well. But it is perfectly possible that if your story idea or characters are strong enough or close enough to who you are or the story that you need to tell, that they will stick with you. The story may evolve, the theme may evolve, the characters may evolve, but the core story is still there. I know that that's happened to me multiple times and something that I've been told very frequently, again, not to do, on the fear of it's clingy, you need to have new story ideas, but I don't see anything wrong with refining old story ideas as long as you're not just copying and pasting constantly. What you need to do with those story ideas is give them room to grow and evolve with you. But there's a reason you thought of them in the first place. If you can hold on to that reason, and if it's a reason that sticks with you as you get older, then there's nothing wrong with going back to old story ideas and giving them another shot, or just literally never giving up on them. I know I've worked on a piece for, 6 years now. That was one of my first story ideas, and I know that Pocket has a very similar story.
Yes. While mine I agree with, and also want to add that this also applies to characters and never giving up on characters that you think should be around. I too have now been working on a story for we're approaching a decade, but not quite there yet, I think.
A decade.
Yeah, a decade. And a select few of you have seen a little bit of work of it. I did a turnaround of that character. I still think it's a genuinely interesting idea. If you're capable of looking at your stuff and scrutinizing whether or not it's worth keeping around, I do think there's a lot of merit to continuing to work on something that you thought was cool in the first place.
Also, although on that note, also never be afraid to scrap stories. I've definitely written stories with characters that I loved very much, but that I looked at and I went, no, I don't think this is something that needs to be said. Or I think there's one character in here that's really strong, but they're kind of holding up the entire story. In that case, take that character, set them to the side, and find another home for them where they're playing an equal part with everyone else. That might take ages, and you might end up with four characters that came from completely different stories cobbled together. Let me tell you, those are some of the most interesting stories you will ever get. Because those are going to be characters that are going to play off each other very well.
Hello, Pocket here. As I was editing this video, it ended up being an hour long, and I figured you guys would rather watch it in two separate parts than one giant video. So we're going to call it a day here, and next week on Monday, I'm going to be uploading the second part where we continue talking about literature, look into overlap, and some of the best and worst advice we've gotten since we were little writers and artists. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time with the second part of this. Thank you.